When you think of Howard Hughes, you probably picture one of two things, right? Either the young, dashing aviator, the Hollywood guy, or this strange hermit figure hidden away.
Exactly. And today, we're going to try and bridge that gap. We've got a whole stack of sources here, business records, personal accounts, political dealings, to really dig into how the man who was once, you know, everywhere ended up choosing complete, almost bizarre isolation.
Yeah, it's a story of extremes.
Yeah.
And the popular idea often just lands on, oh, he went mad.
Right, but we want to be more specific. Our focus today is really on the documented facts from his later decades. We're tracing that shift, from the public hero everyone knew to this private, almost invisible enigma.
And the paradox there. How did he maintain such immense power running this huge empire while his personal life was frankly falling apart?
That's the core question. How did the power structure keep going even as the man himself retreated into these rituals, these self-imposed rules?
We've got some fascinating material. We'll look at his early, super glamorous social life. Quite the contrast. Then there's this unusual moment in 1944 where he actually had to step out and fight for a project in Washington.
And then the evolution of Hughes aircraft. How it went from his personal, toy almost, to this vital piece of government infrastructure.
And finally, we get into the weird stuff. The life inside those hotel bungalows, the memos, the armies of aides. How did that even work? How did a billion-dollar operation function like that?
Okay, so to really get how deep his isolation became later, you need to appreciate just how present he was before. He wasn't just wealthy, he moved in the absolute highest circles.
Yeah, this contrast is key. He wasn't some outsider looking in. The sources constantly mention him being a regular fixture at William Randolph Hearst's parties at San Simeon. And those parties, they were something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely legendary. And the logistics alone tell you the scale. If you were invited, you didn't just drive up the coast. No, you had to be at the Glendale Railroad Station.
Yeah.
7:35 p.m. sharp on a Friday.
Wow. Specific.
Very. And there you'd board Hearst's private train, 2 sleeping cars, a dining car, fully stocked, of course, for the overnight trip up to the estate.
A private train just for the party guests.
Yeah.
Incredible. And I remember reading the sources mention something about the drinking rules being kind of strange once they got there.
That's right. Hearst, the host, was famously a teetotaler. Bit awkward for throwing lavish parties,
Yeah, just a bit.
So he had this strict rule. No hard liquor inside the main house, La Casa Grande. The only compromise was exactly 2 cocktails allowed before dinner. Wine during dinner was okay, unlimited apparently, but otherwise quite sober inside the castle walls.
So a majestic setting, but with slightly odd, strict house rules.
Definitely. But the real surreal part wasn't just the rules, it was the environment itself. San Simeon wasn't just a mansion, it was this enormous 350,000-acre estate overlooking the ocean, and Hearst had turned it into basically a private zoo.
Right, with animals just wandering around.
Exactly. You'd be there, maybe chatting with Irving Thalberg, Norma Shearer, Chaplin, Louis B. Mayer, the absolute Hollywood royalty. And you look out and there are zebras, giraffes, emus, camels, yaks. The sources list them all, just freely roaming the grounds.
That must have felt completely unreal, like stepping into another world.
Totally. And Hughes was right there, consistently part of this inner circle. Now, everyone knew he was shy, kind of quiet, maybe awkward with new people.
Yeah, that reputation was already there.
But he had the money, the fame, the cachet to be accepted, even desired in that world. It wasn't just about being rich. It was about being inside the innermost sanctum of American power and celebrity at the time.
And knowing that makes his later withdrawal so much more striking, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows this wasn't just a guy who couldn't cope with society. He had mastered it, or at least he had access to its highest levels. He chose to leave it.
So the retreat wasn't forced on him initially. It was a conscious decision.
It seems that way. A deliberate withdrawal from a world he'd already navigated. And that context makes the image of him later, locked in a sterile room, only communicating through notes. It makes it feel even more, tragic and dramatic.
Okay, so he had this incredible access, but the seeds of withdrawal were perhaps already there. But the shift wasn't overnight. There's this really interesting moment, the sources detail, back in the 1940s, where he actually had to break that pattern of distance.
Yeah, this is a fascinating detour from the path he seemed to be heading down. It involved the H-4 Hercules, that enormous flying boat, the one people call the Spruce Goose.
Right, the massive wooden plane.
That's the one. And by 1944, the government was seriously considering canceling the project. Hughes, who had initially been sort of lukewarm on it, had become completely obsessed with building the world's biggest airplane. It was a huge personal challenge for him.
And normally by this point, he'd send his lawyers or executives to handle this kind of political fight, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. That was already his standard operating procedure. Let the subordinates handle the messy, face-to-face stuff. But this, the potential cancellation of the H-4, that hit differently.
So what did he do?
He did something totally uncharacteristic for the Hughes of that era. He personally flew to Washington, D.C., and basically became his own lobbyist.
Wow. He really threw himself into it.
He really did. For 5 solid weeks, February into March of '44, he set up shop in a suite at the Carlton Hotel. And this guy who hated meetings, hated confrontation, he spent day and night personally calling on, meeting with, arguing with top officials, War Department, War Production Board, Air Force brass, everyone.
You have to imagine the personal cost for him. Someone known for being pathologically shy, suddenly thrust into the heart of wartime Washington politics. That must have been incredibly stressful.
Oh, the sources make it clear it was. He didn't just feel pressured, he felt actively attacked. He later said he felt like everybody in Washington was against me.
Really? He felt targeted.
Yeah, and he used this phrase, he felt he was about as unpopular as any country boy who ever came to Washington.
That's incredible. Howard Hughes, the billionaire industrialist, feeling like an outsider, a country boy. It really shows how much he disliked that whole environment.
It does, and maybe why he avoided it so much later. This whole episode is significant because it was one of the last times he really engaged directly and publicly in that kind of high-stakes personal battle.
He put himself out there, fought tooth and nail.
Right. It took a massive amount of his personal energy. He saved the flying boat project. It wasn't scrapped then, but you have to wonder if the sheer exhaustion and unpleasantness of it just reinforced his desire to retreat, to manage things from a distance, through layers of aids from then on.
A victory, maybe, but one that pushed him further towards isolation in the long run.
Quite possibly. It was a rare, intense burst of public engagement before the final long retreat began.
Okay, so that battle for the flying boat, in a way, points towards the next big development, doesn't it? The shift in what Hughes aircraft actually was.
Absolutely. This is a crucial transformation, maybe one of the most important in the whole Hughes story, certainly for his empire's longevity. Hughes aircraft stopped being just, Howard's expensive hobby or passion project.
It became something more vital.
Much more vital. By 1953, the sources are describing it very differently. It wasn't his private plaything anymore. It had become what analysts were calling a quasi-public institution.
Quasi-public. What does that mean in practice? It was still owned by him, right?
Oh, yeah. 100% privately owned by Hughes. But quasi-public meant its function was now deeply tied to the public interest, specifically to national defense. It was making essential stuff, advanced radar systems, guidance technology, things critical for the Cold War air defense network.
So its success wasn't just about Hughes anymore. It was about national security.
Precisely. And this created a really fundamental, almost hidden shift in how the company was funded.
So it wasn't just running on profits from his other businesses, like the tool company.
Not primarily, no. While the Hughes Tool Company, HT Co., was still the bedrock of his personal fortune, Hughes Aircraft itself was increasingly being, as the sources put it, nourished by federal tax dollars.
Government contracts, basically.
Massive government contracts, funding huge R&D projects, paying for big production runs of military hardware. It meant a steady stream of revenue, essentially guaranteed by the Pentagon.
Which is kind of ironic, given Hughes's image as this ultimate individualist, supposedly wary of government interference.
Hugely ironic. He became incredibly dependent on the very government structures he often seemed to distrust. But it worked. The relationship between Hughes Aircraft and the Defense Department grew into this. Well, the term used is mutually satisfying partnership.
They needed his tech, he needed their money.
Exactly, and that symbiotic relationship insulated the company, to a degree, from the increasingly erratic behavior of its owner. The business became too important to fail.
Which leads us to what happened when his personal issues started to directly impact the company's operations.
Right. Because eventually they did. There was this major internal conflict brewing between Hughes himself and the managers running the aircraft company day to day, and the Air Force got wind of it.
And they were worried.
They were highly alarmed. This wasn't just some internal corporate drama. They were terrified that the infighting and chaos would disrupt the production lines, jeopardize the delivery of critical defense systems. National security was potentially at risk because of the owner's eccentricities and management style.
So the government actually had to step in because one man's behavior was seen as a national security threat.
Yes, it reached a crisis point. The situation got so serious that it led to this really extraordinary confrontation. The Secretary of the Air Force himself, Harold E. Talbot, flew out to Los Angeles.
The secretary.
The Secretary flew out specifically for a showdown with Howard Hughes. This was September 18th, 1953. Think about that. The head of the Air Force personally intervening because a private company, vital to defense, was being destabilized by its reclusive, increasingly unpredictable owner. It shows just how indispensable Hughes aircraft had become.
So this pressure from the outside, the government basically saying, get your house in order because we depend on you, did that make Hughes engage more? Or did it push him further away?
It seems to have solidified his retreat. Instead of engaging, he doubled down on creating this completely controlled, isolated environment. By the late 50s, early 60s, he'd really perfected the architecture of his isolation.
And this is when he moves into hotels, like the Beverly Hills Hotel.
Yes, but it wasn't like just checking into a suite. He essentially created a compound within the hotel grounds. He took over Bungalow 4 for himself. But it's the details of how he lived there that reveal just how extreme things had become.
The sources mention his relationship with Jean Peters, the actress he married around this time. How did that fit into this setup?
It didn't, really. That's what's so telling. He was in Bungalow 4, but Jean Peters was housed separately, over in Bungalow 19.
Living in separate bungalows even though they were married.
Yes. And Hughes's explanation, according to the sources, was simply that he was too preoccupied with TWA and other business matters.
The classic too busy excuse.
Right, the acceptable public narrative of the driven tycoon. But it likely masked a much deeper issue, perhaps an inability to cope with the intimacy and, the potential contamination of close human contact, given his developing OCD and germophobia.
And his staff arrangements reflected this need for control and distance, too, right?
Right.
He rented more bungalows just for them.
Oh, yeah. It was a whole operation. He leased Bungalow 1 Senior by specifically for his cooks and waiters. They had to follow incredibly strict procedures for preparing and serving his food.
To meet his cleanliness standards.
Exactly. Extreme germophobia was setting in.
Right.
And then there was Bungalow 1A.
Ah, yes, the storage bungalow. This part is just wild.
It really is. Bungalow 1A wasn't for business files or anything like that. It was purely for supplies. And the descriptions are vivid. Piled high, floor to ceiling, with cases upon cases of Poland water.
The only water he'd drink.
The only one. And cartons, just mountains of cartons of Kleenex tissues.
Kleenex? So many Kleenexes.
Thousands upon thousands of boxes. It wasn't just having supplies on hand, it was stockpiling on an industrial scale, driven by these compulsive needs. A luxury hotel bungalow turned into a warehouse for bottled water and tissues.
It's such a stark image of how his obsessions were manifesting, how his immense wealth was being used to build this fortress of ritual.
And maintaining this fortress required people, a lot of people, structured in layers. He had his core aides, like John Holmes, who supervised the food prep, took dictation for the endless memos.
Memos were his primary way of communicating by then.
Almost exclusively. Face-to-face contact was becoming rarer and rarer. Holmes would sometimes camp out in Bungalow 1C, the staff bungalow, when Hughes didn't want him even that close.
And then there was another layer of staff.
Yes, this dedicated group known as the Third Man Detail. Their only job was fetching things. Newspapers, magazines, more Poland water, and of course the constant resupply of Kleenex. They were messengers, doormen, general gophers, ensuring Hughes never had to interact with the outside world or even directly with most of his own staff to get these specific items.
So you have this incredibly insulated system. Hughes in the center, communicating via memo, John Holmes managing the immediate circle, taking dictation. Then the third man detail running errands.
Exactly. It was a system designed for maximum isolation for Hughes. But think about the power dynamics.
Right. If Holmes is the one taking dictation, writing down the memos, how much influence did he have? Was he just transcribing or was he interpreting, filtering?
That becomes the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Or rather, the billion-dollar question. Holmes took over dictation when a previous aide got sick. Suddenly, he's the primary conduit for Hughes's thoughts and instructions flowing out, and presumably for information flowing in.
So the gatekeeper becomes incredibly powerful.
Immensely powerful. This small group of aides, often referred to later as the Mormon Mafia, because many were members of the LDS Church known for their loyalty and discretion, they effectively controlled access to Hughes and controlled the information from Hughes. His need for isolation created a structure where his aides weren't just caretakers, they were potentially becoming the de facto operators of his empire. #TagV power, control, and political shadows.
It's fascinating, though, that even while he's building this incredibly isolated, ritualistic world for himself, His mind seems still focused on maintaining control over his business empire, especially TWA.
Oh, absolutely. The drive for control, especially financial and corporate control, never seemed to leave him, even as his personal life dissolved. TWA was a huge battleground for him during this period.
And he faced a major setback there, didn't he? Something about a voting trust.
A massive setback. In 1961, the courts imposed a voting trust on his controlling shares of TWA. For someone like Hughes, who craved absolute control, this was devastating.
Can you just quickly explain what that meant, practically?
Sure. It meant that even though he still technically owned the majority of TWA stock, the voting rights attached to that stock were transferred to independent trustees. He couldn't fire the board, he couldn't dictate policy, he couldn't approve financing deals. He was essentially sidelined from running the airline he owned, a huge loss of face and power.
You'd think that might break his spirit, or at least make him reconsider his isolation.
You might think so, but the sources show something different. There's this memo from February 1961, right after the trust was imposed. He's writing to an aide about some jets he'd ordered for TWA.
Still making plans for the airline he technically couldn't control.
Exactly. And in the memo, he states, completely confidently, that HT So, the Hughes Tool Company, his financial mothership, would still control TWA when that matter comes up.
Wow. So even facing this huge legal defeat, he was already plotting his comeback, convinced he'd win in the end.
Utterly convinced. He saw it as a temporary obstacle. He believed his financial resources and, I suppose, his sheer willpower would eventually prevail. The strategic business mind was still very much active, even if it was operating purely through these dictated memos from inside his sterile bunker.
The persistence is remarkable, even if the method was unusual.
It shows the disconnect, doesn't it? The mind still capable of complex corporate strategy, while the person was increasingly incapable of normal human interaction. And actually, the source notes he wasn't that patient about TWO. Just weeks after that memo, he launched a really aggressive public attack against the airline's management. So the fight was still very much on in his mind.
And this whole setup, the extreme secrecy, the reliance on fiercely loyal aides operating in the shadows, this eventually casts a really long shadow, doesn't it? All the way to Watergate.
This is one of the most intriguing, almost unbelievable connections that comes up in the sources. One of Hughes's key lieutenants, a guy named Robert Bennett, he ends up playing this really significant but very shadowy role in the Watergate investigation years later.
How so? What did he do?
Well, the sources describe him, alongside the famous Deep Throat informant, as one of the two most important anonymous sources feeding information to investigators and journalists, helping to unravel the whole scandal.
So, an operative from the Hughes organization, this super-secretive private empire, was deeply involved in bringing down a U.S. president.
It seems so. It speaks volumes about the kind of networks and information-gathering capabilities the Hughes operation had built up over the years. They were masters of operating behind the scenes, dealing in secrets and influence, completely off the public radar. Bennett knew how to work in the shadows.
And wasn't there even speculation that Bennett himself was Deep Throat?
There was. The level of secrecy around his involvement was so intense that rumors circulated. Bennett himself always strongly denied it, but the fact that the rumor even existed shows how powerful and mysterious the Hughes political operation was perceived to be, even long after Hughes himself had vanished from public view.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
His power didn't vanish when he locked himself away. It just changed form. It became this hidden, unaccountable force wielded by his aides.
Exactly. The isolation of Hughes, paradoxically, might have made the operational power of his lieutenants even more absolute, allowing them to influence major national events from behind this veil of secrecy, funded by his immense wealth, #outro.
So when you pull it all together, from the glamour San Simeon with roaming zebras to the Kleenex-filled bungalows, this deep dive really highlights a kind of separation, doesn't it?
A profound separation. You see that enormous corporate power, this billion-dollar empire, deeply entangled with national security, can actually exist almost entirely independently from the personal well-being, the mental state, even the physical presence of the person who owns it all.
Once Hughes aircraft became so vital, so tied into government contracts, the system itself just kept going.
It developed its own momentum, its own inertia. The Pentagon needed those radar systems. The contracts kept flowing. The structure built around Hughes, the aides, the lawyers, the managers, it became self-perpetuating. It had to keep functioning, regardless of whether the boss was dictating memos about opening peach cans or demanding specific movie screenings at 3 a.m.
In a weird way, the structure designed to accommodate his eccentricities ended up protecting the empire from his eccentricities, or at least from their most damaging potential consequences.
You could argue that the system became insulated, but it raises that fundamental question about unchecked wealth and power when the person at the top essentially opts out of reality.
Does that extreme isolation actually preserve the empire by making it run impersonally, managed by these proxies?
Or does it just hand over the keys? Does it simply replace the original tycoon's control with the control of the aides, the gatekeepers who manage the information, interpret the wishes, and ultimately shape the reality of the person they serve?
That really is the question to ponder, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happens when the messenger, the person controlling the flow of Poland water and Kleenex and, more importantly, information, what happens when they become the real power behind the throne, the unseen hand guiding a vast fortune?
How long can that kind of mediated control last? And how connected is it ultimately to the world it's supposed to be influencing? That's something to think about.